The Norman line broke and ran, and Harold's housecarls did not move. On the slope of Senlac Hill, in the failing light of 14 October 1066, the most disciplined infantry in northern Europe watched their enemy flee down the trampled grass and held their formation behind the shield wall, spears locked, refusing the bait. It was the feigned retreat, the gambit that in another telling would have won the day, drawing the English off the ridge to be ridden down in the open. But the line did not chase, and into the gap that should have swallowed the English came William, Duke of Normandy, riding hard to rally a host, dissolving into panic, lifting his helm so his men would know he still lived. A press of fleeing knights and stubborn ferdmen closed around him. His horse went down. The Duke was dragged from the saddle and cut to pieces in the rout he himself had hoped to provoke. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened, and why the real history unfolded differently. For everything to this moment is true. The disputed succession after Edward the Confessor died childless on the 5th of January 1066, the Witten's acclamation of Harold, the bloodletting at Stamford Bridge against Harold Hardrada, the desperate march south. Only here, on this hill, does the thread fork, and what followed would face England not toward Rouen, but toward the cold grey waters of the North Sea. By nightfall, the question was no longer whether the Normans could win, but whether they could leave. Leaderless, their cavalry blunted, and their archers spent, the invaders fell back toward the coast they had landed on only weeks before, at Pevensey on 28 September. There was no second commander of William's stature to gather them. The men who might have rallied the host were dead on the slope or scattered in the dark. The survivors did what beaten armies do when the sea is at their backs and the country is rising against them. They re-embarked. The ships that had carried an invasion carried home a remnant, and the autumn gales of the Channel took their toll on the crossing. Harold, for his part, was a king who had now survived 2 invasions in a single season, the Norwegian storm broken at Stamford Bridge, the Norman gamble broken at Hastings. He was wounded, his army exhausted, his brothers Gurth and Leofwine alive, where another telling would have buried them beside him. He did not pursue across the water. He turned instead to the harder work of holding what he had kept. A lesser king might have ruled by the sword alone after such a victory. Harold did not. The kingdom he had defended was already among the most sophisticated in Europe, a centralized realm of shires and sheriffs, of silver coinage struck to a common standard, of law written in the English tongue. To dismantle that machinery would have been to discard the very strength that let him raise armies twice in a month. So Harold ruled through the Witenagemot rather than against it, the council of magnates and bishops that had acclaimed him in the first place. He needed the north most of all. Edwin and Morcar, the young earls of Mercia and Northumbria, whose levies had been mauled before Stamford Bridge, were courted rather than crushed, their authority confirmed, their loyalty bought with confirmation and not threat. The House of Godwin bound itself tighter to the old institutions, knowing that a crown won by acclamation could be unmade the same way. But the survival of a dynasty is never settled in a single autumn, and across the Channel a different unraveling had already begun. Normandy woke to find itself a duchy without a duke, and with a child for an heir. Robert Curthose, William's eldest son, was a boy when the news came home across the water, and around him gathered exactly the men a strong duke had spent his life holding in check, barons with long memories and short patience, each measuring the others. The regency that should have governed instead quarreled, and a weakened Normandy was precisely what King Philip I of France had been waiting for. The French crown had watched the duchy's rise on its northern border with unease. Now it pressed where it could, encouraging rivals, nibbling at frontiers, content to let a dangerous vassal turn its energies inward. The appetite for cross-channel adventure, so consuming in William, died with him on Senlac Hill. There would be no Norman aristocracy planted in English soil, no castles rising over conquered shires, no foreign tongue installed above the law courts. The conquest that reshaped a nation in our history simply did not happen. Normandy, fractured and besieged, had troubles enough of its own. The greater danger to Harold's England came not from the south, but from across the North Sea. Sweyn the Istridson, king of Denmark and kinsman to the old royal house, had a claim of his own to press. England had been ruled within living memory by Canute the Great, and the Anglo-Danish bond ran deep through the realm's blood and its trade. Sweyn revived those Scandinavian claims, and a more brittle dynasty might have answered with war. Harold's heirs answered differently. They reached for marriage, for tribute, for the slow diplomacy of merchants and bishops rather than the quick decision of battle. It was cheaper than fighting, and for a North Sea kingdom, more natural. The ties that bound English ports to Danish ones thickened, kinship reinforced by commerce, rivalry softened into a wary partnership. England did not become Danish, but it leaned, decade by decade, into a Scandinavian world it had always half belonged to, and the channel grew wider in the imagination than the sea that linked it to Roskilde. Perhaps the deepest consequence was the one no chronicler would have thought to record. The language did not break. In our history, the Norman Conquest drove a wedge through English itself, burying the old tongue beneath centuries of French as the speech of law, court, and aristocracy. Here, no such wedge was driven. Old English remained the language of the charter and the writ, of the shire court and the king's writ room, absorbing Norse words from its northern neighbours as it always had, but never fractured by a foreign ruling class. The written administration of the late Saxon state, already remarkable, already literate in the vernacular, continued without rupture. Clerks wrote English, judges spoke it. The slow drift that turns one language into another went on, but along its own grain, bending toward Scandinavia rather than toward France. 1,000 words that history would have lent from Paris were never borrowed. The tongue grew, as living tongues do, but it grew unbroken. No great survey was ever ordered, because there was nothing to inventory. In our history, 20 years after Hastings, the Norman King's commissioners fanned out across England to record every hide and plough and peasant in the great reckoning called Domesday, the audit of a conquered country whose lands had been stripped from one aristocracy and handed wholesale to another. None of that happened here. There was no wholesale redistribution of estates, no scaffold of foreign lords erected atop English soil, and so no need to count what had not changed hands. The patterns of Saxon landholding persisted, local custom, the rights of free peasants, the tangled inheritances of families who had held the same ground for generations. Where the Norman record would have rewritten a nation's tenure with a stroke, the older arrangements simply continued, messier and more various, and rooted in memory, rather than in a conqueror's ledger. We should be careful here, for the deep currents of a society are slow and hard to read, but the great rupture did not come, and what does not break tends to endure. In the end, England settled into the place its geography had always suggested, the western anchor of a Scandinavian-leaning world. Its church kept its English saints and its English speech. Its court looked across the grey water toward Bergen and Roskilde and the trading towns of the Baltic, and only rarely toward Rouen and Paris. The Channel became a frontier rather than a bridge, and the North Sea became a highway. This is not destiny, and it was not inevitable. A different battle, a stray arrow finding its mark, a single line breaking on a single hill, and the whole pattern dissolves into the history we know. The men on Senlac Hill could not have seen any of it. They saw only the slope, and the enemy running, and the discipline that told them not to follow. What we have traced from that one held line is a guess, offered tentatively, about how far a single afternoon might reach. The wall held, and a kingdom that should have been conquered turned instead toward the sea, and remained, for a while longer, itself.